So in this session, I would like to talk the most about my passion for family history and my own family research. And through this, I hope that you get to know me a bit better and maybe get a better understanding of my heritage. And so my love affair with genealogy began at the age of 13. I've been doing genealogy for about 35 years. And it all started with a school project that you have to do in Israel to cover your roots, and you can see the pictures of it here. And as you know, genealogy is never complete, it's never finished. And so I had unfinished business with that school project, and I always wanted to get back to it and continue it. And about 15 years ago, after a career in high tech, I summoned the courage to create MyHeritage as a startup, as a one-man company from my home, in the hope of turning my hobby of genealogy into my job. And the rest is history. It was very difficult to start a company from scratch in genealogy, and I can fill a whole talk about the adventures of that, but I'll just describe a few moments in the journey along the way. Here you can see the original logo candidates that were presented to me by the designers, and I chose the one on the top left. And you can see that the name of the product was supposed to be Heritage with an exclamation mark, because my point was that despite what some people may think, heritage is very exciting, it's very technological, it's a lot of fun, so it was Heritage with an exclamation mark. Later I had to change it to MyHeritage. And this is the sketch of the first website in 2004. And you can see that the name at the top is Inbal. That's actually how I named the company originally. Inbal is my daughter. And so this was supposed to be a family company for family history. And you can see the motto at the center of the screen, which says it all: when a hobby becomes a passion. That really sums it up for me. You can also see at the bottom all the language logos, because it was very important for me from the very start of the company to make it an international company that supports many languages, and today we support 42 of them. We had very humble beginnings the first 2 years from my home. Then we expanded into another home. This is a German Templar house in the same village where I work, and we came here when there were 2 of us, and continued until they kicked us out when we were 70 people. And the team started very small, and here we are, all of us in 2007. This is the Israeli version of Halloween. It's Purim. And the team grew. Here in 2008, some of you may recognize on the right-hand side that Daniel Horowitz, also Uri Gonen joined, and many other good people who are still with us. Here, this is a historical moment. Our chief architect, Ran, is about to press enter on the keyboard and launch into the website our super search engine for historical records. It was April 2012, and the 1940 US Census, which was the first collection we've ever digitized ourselves. And since then, we now have more than 9 billion records for you guys. But this was the second when it was launched. And now, as you can see, we've gone a long way. There are about 430 of us all around the world. This is a picture taken earlier this year from our headquarters in Israel. We also have offices, 2 offices in Israel, an office in California, in Utah, in Ukraine, and we have representatives in many countries around the world. And now I want to tell you a little story of my own family. We are genealogists and we all love stories. And my story comes from the small city of Bialystok, which is in northeastern Poland today. It used to be part of Russia, changed hands a lot. And it was quite a small city. Today it's about the 10th largest in terms of population in Poland. And in the old days, it was mostly a Jewish town. And in the Russian Empire census of 1897, about 63% of the population was Jewish. So Bialystok, despite being a very small town, had some contributions to the world. I guess most of you can can understand what this means. It says, I love genealogy. But do you know what language this is in? All right, we have some Esperanto speakers in the house. So this is indeed Esperanto. It's one of the world's most successful constructed languages. It has about 2 million speakers. And it was created by Ludwig Laser Zamenhof, who came from the small Jewish community of Bialystok. Now, my family also came from that small town, and it was a very typical Jewish family, and we were tailors. And here, in this oldest photo of my family that we have, from about 1905 from Bialystok, you can see my grandfather, who is this small kid. And together with him, you see in the center his parents, and even his grandmother, who looks like an ancient dinosaur. Interestingly, those of you with sharp eyes, you may notice that she has Asian features, and she has, we think, some Mongolian and Chinese DNA, which was sometimes found in the Jews from Russia, and it is very interesting, and I intend to research that further. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to my grandfather, whom I will talk about. And he was born in 1900 in Bialystok by the name of Chaim Pat. Chaim in Hebrew means life. Later, he changed his surname from Pat to Japhet, which is my current last name. Japhet is biblical, and it was common for pioneers arriving into Israel to pick for themselves a nice biblical name. So that was the end of Pat. And you can see here from the pictures that my grandfather, as much as pictures can tell a story, was a very young, idealistic, fiercely determined young man. I can also add handsome. He was unstoppable. He came to Israel in 1920 when he was only 20 years old, and I'll tell you a bit later on the specifics of this remarkable story. And he married my grandmother in 1926 in Israel. So you can see here grandfather Chaim, grandmother Rosa, and as a small kid, my father, Gideon Japhet. This was taken in 1932. Now, because I'm going to focus on my grandfather, I thought it would be appropriate to say a few words about my grandmother, Rosa. She was born in Valkyninkai in Lithuania, and she was from a family of Zionists who believed that the future of the Jewish people lies in Israel. And so the family immigrated to Israel in 1911 when she was a young child, and she became a nurse, and she studied in the first ever school of nurses, and she is a graduate of the first cycle of nurses, one of the only 22 that made it out of 400. And you can see her in this picture along with Henrietta Sold, who is founder of Hadassah, founder of this nurse school, and founder of social welfare in Israel. And Henrietta Sold plays an important role also in the life of my grandfather, as you will soon see. So back to my grandfather, Chaim. I loved him very much. I suffered a deep loss when he passed away when I was 15 years old, and I have many great memories from him. And he's one of the reasons that I was attracted to genealogy, because for some of us, it's the connection with a loved grandparent and wishing to connect to them after they are gone and learn more about them through genealogy. And so it was for me. And here you can see him in my bar mitzvah when I was 13. So I want to tell you a little bit about my grandfather's remarkable story. He left everything behind and left Bialystok in 1920, coming to Israel to forge a new future for himself in Israel. He dreamed about that moment all his youth, and he prepared for it. He studied Hebrew, which he knew was going to be very important in Israel. And he came with nothing. He was completely penniless. He had no job. And he was sent, like many other pioneers, to build the roads in the new country. And that was very difficult physical labor with almost no pay, very, very tough. So my grandfather was out, and he loved sports. He was a gymnast from Maccabi Bialystok. He loved to exercise. He was building the roads. But in the weekend, what do? You go to the holy city of Jerusalem. And I think he had another motive of finding a better job. So he goes to Jerusalem, and the first thing he asks everybody is, is there any gym in the city? I want to practice. So they're saying, well, we have only one. So they point his way to the only gym in Jerusalem, and he goes there and he starts to exercise. And everybody around him is very impressed. They say, you are fantastic. You've got to be our instructor. Unfortunately, we can't pay you. But they found a solution. There was a job opening as assistant gardener. And so they made my grandfather assistant gardener so that he could work during the day and be a gym instructor for free at night. And this way he left the roads and a new chapter opened for him. Now, he was lucky, but sometimes people say that luck comes to those who deserve it. There was going to be a big political convention in the same gym where he was instructing. And the gardener was assigned to decorate the hall. And what do you do when you have an assistant? You assign the job to your assistant. So my grandfather, being a very talented and hardworking young man, he jumped up and down, and he decorated the hall like it was never seen before in Jerusalem. So when the convention happened, it was for a newly formed organization in Israel called the Va'ad Leumi. The Va'ad Leumi was the first organization that tried to organize the lives of the Jews in the Holy Land. This was 30 years before Israel became an independent state, but that was the beginning. So they were having a convention, and they asked, who decorated this hall so beautifully? So they said, this guy. So they call him up and say, Chaim, can you do some more things? Can you speak Hebrew? Can you read and write? Are you literate? Are you a scholar? And they were very impressed with him because the answer was yes. And so that was the end of his career as an assistant gardener, and they recruited him immediately into the Va'ad Leumi. And they made him a secretary at first. He was a secretary, and he was in charge of writing the protocols for all the meetings in multiple languages. And he was assigned to work on a stenotype, which is a very early version of a typewriter, the only one in the country that was adjusted to work in Hebrew. So he was proud to be the boss of that machine, and we will see soon the significance of that. And he was promoted through the ranks until he was spotted by Henrietta Sod, the founder of social welfare in Israel, and she said, "You got to be my deputy." And he became her deputy and right-hand man, and together with her, over several decades, he was the founder of social welfare in Israel. And he became the director of social welfare in the country, and he didn't like politics so much, so the most that he was deputy minister in the first Israeli government that was formed. So this is how he had this remarkable Cinderella story, and he used to say, it's all thanks to sports. And as a genealogist, I am obsessed with collecting any bits of information I can about my grandfather, and here are some of his diplomas, certificates throughout his life, showing also my grandmother. The family in Bialystok was very poor, so every bit of money that my grandfather could save from his work in the Va'ad Leumi, he collected the money and he sent it back to Bialystok to save the family from poverty. But he was also a fierce believer that the future of the Jews in Europe was dark and that they've all got to come to Israel and create a better future for themselves. So he worked relentlessly to convince his family members to follow in his footsteps and come to Israel with him. And he even wrote articles for the Jewish newspapers in Bialystok, encouraging the entire population to come to Israel. Thanks to his efforts, 4 of his siblings did come to Israel in the 1920s, and all of them who left Bialystok were in fact saved from the Holocaust. because they married and raised families in Israel. And here you can see his sisters and brother who followed him to Israel and were saved. But Chaim could not save everyone. And some members of the family stayed behind. This is a tragic photo taken in 1939 on the eve of the Holocaust. The occasion was that Yanche, who was my grandfather's nephew, he is marked in orange, was about to immigrate to Israel. My grandfather worked relentlessly to bring all his family, his siblings, his nephews, everyone he can. So here, in 1939, Yanche poses for a farewell photo with the members of the Pat family from Bialystok who stayed behind. 1 year after this photo was taken, my great-grandfather died of natural causes. I marked him in green. But everyone else in this photo was murdered by the Nazis in Treblinka. And this includes 3 other brothers and sisters of my grandfather and their spouses and their 6 children. And in fact, many more members of my family from Bialystok perished, all the cousins of those that you see here. So you can see that my grandfather had the foresight to save himself and large parts of his family. And I think thanks to him, MyHeritage exists, in fact. A small interjection. I use MyHeritage to preserve the memory of my grandfather and to collect all the photos and share them with my family members. So here you can see a MyHeritage screen showing pictures where my grandfather appears. I have thousands of historical photos from my family that I'm collecting, and I keep working on that even till this day. And I tag all the photos because it's much easier to see who is in each photo. And MyHeritage is the first genealogy service to support tagging of people in photos. I know that because I invented this. Back in 2004, there were no applications at all that supported tagging people in photographs. And I did not want to put a photo and say that my grandma is 7th from the left on the 4th row from the back and have people counting the faces. So I invented photo tagging. And that was many years until it became a natural activity on Facebook and other websites. I encourage all of you to use these facilities to tag each and every person in your historical photos. MyHeritage has also another feature where you can add the reverse side of a photo. And it's still the only genealogy service today that supports it. You use Family Tree Builder to do that because this is in recognition that a lot of photos have a dedication or inscription behind that's important to show side by side. This is the wedding photo of Chaim and Rosa, and behind it, he wrote a love poem for her. Now, I wanted to create a chart of the family, and you want to hang the chart on your wall. So I was looking for the most condensed format for a family tree chart of descendants with the most amount of people in the smallest amount of space. And to do this, I was inspired by a Jewish descendant chart format that was common in the community of Corfu in Greece that I was researching. You can see here one of these original charts, and it was very clever because people had more space if they had more descendants in the following generations. So I wanted to do something like this, but you know now that I love photos. And so I invented the sun chart, which is a modern rendition of that Corfu chart, but with photos. So this is the world's only descendant fan charts that has photos. And the algorithm was brilliantly implemented by my talented colleague Uri Gonen. And now all of you can enjoy that also in MyHeritage. And this is what I have hanging in my office, and I sent copies of it to all my family members. And when you zoom in, you can see that the detail is fantastic, and you can add as much information as you like. This is the part showing my grandfather and my father and myself zooming in into that sun chart. And I make it a point that every time I'm photographed for the press, I ask them to include that sun chart of the Pat family. MyHeritage was recently selected as one of the most promising startups in Israel in the Israeli press, and you can see me holding a picture of my mother, and behind me, the family tree chart of my parental side. And here is how you generate the sun chart for yourself. You go to the family tree menu, print charts and books, and then you select the sun chart among the other formats, for those of you not familiar with this great format. Now, even for us experienced genealogists, there is always more to discover. And even in my grandfather's family, I hit a brick wall, a dead end. And it was the mysterious uncle of my grandfather. His name was Yehuda Tzadik Pat. My grandfather mentioned this uncle, and I had him in the family tree, and I knew nothing about him and no information about descendants. And I was always wondering, what happened to the family of Yehuda Pat? So, as a genealogist, I decided to go deep into research and to try to unravel that mystery. I went to the Ellis Island database, and I searched for everyone from the city of Bialystok who ever came to the United States. We are talking about thousands of people. I went over them one by one by one by one, until I hit the discovery that I was looking for. I found the passenger manifest of a traveler named Beryl Adin. He was going to New York to a certain address, and he was about to join his father-in-law, Yudel Zadik Pass, which is the Yiddish pronunciation of Yehuda Tzadik Pat. And that was in 1905. So that was an amazing discovery. The long-lost uncle was in fact in the United States in 1905. I was very happy because, as I've explained to you, if you stayed behind in Bialystok, you would not survive. And if a family member managed to get to the United States, they would probably stay there and raise a family, and I would find the descendants. Because for me, genealogy is not so much about finding dead ancestors, but it's more about finding and connecting with living relatives. Of course, you need the dead ancestors to find the living relatives. So I was really excited when I found this passenger record. Unfortunately, you can see that the stamp here says deported, and my happiness was short-lived because a few days later he was sent back to Europe from the United States because he had tuberculosis and they would not let him in. And that unfortunately sealed his fate because I looked for him in the Yad Vashem database and found that Beryl Adin, with his wife, daughter of Yehuda Tzadik Pat, perished in the Holocaust eventually in Treblinka. So that was still a dead end, and all the signs pointed at Yehuda Tzadik also returning from the United States back to Europe, and maybe it was because the family was deported. So that was still a dead end. But you know, sometimes you get lucky. Last year, a woman from the United States, who is also a genealogist, found me on MyHeritage. She was looking for some ancestor of hers with the last name of Pat from Bialystok, and she thought I may know something about that. We compared notes, and it turns out that her ancestor was misspelled. He was some Yehudi Ztodok Pat, but I could easily see that this was the missing uncle of my grandfather. He was her ancestor. And we took DNA tests, and they confirmed the connection. So we found the lost branch of my grandfather's uncle, and it's a lovely branch. They live today in the United States. They still kept the last name of Pat. And they are all descendants of one child of Yehuda Tzadik Pat. His name was Isaac, who made it to the United States and built a life for himself there. And he was a first cousin of my grandfather, Chaim. So I did some research about this Isaac Pat, the cousin, and I got a beautiful picture of him and his wife from the family in the United States. And I found his immigration record to the United States in 1904. And as a genealogist, I try to file in my brain all kinds of useful and useless information in the hope that something will come out of it eventually. And I immediately noticed that the address that Isaac Pat was traveling to in New York was the very same address that Berl Adin was traveling to join his father-in-law, Yehuda Tzadik Pat. They were all living in one apartment in New York. Now, after this, when I realized the importance of this question, which relative are you joining, that immigrants were asked at Ellis Island, I asked the MyHeritage staff to digitize those answers in all the Ellis Island records. And this is why today MyHeritage is the only website with an Ellis Island collection that has the additional names of the family relatives that the passengers were joining in the United States and leaving behind in their homeland. 26 million additional names that you will find only on MyHeritage. So Yudel Tzadik Pat can now be found in the index, and you don't need to go over thousands of manifest records manually to find things like that. All of you can take advantage of that now. Now, following this recent discovery, I now realize the importance of addresses. And I'm going to ask my team now to index all the addresses that the passengers were going to in the United States, because if you're a smart genealogist and you're going to search by that address, knowing where your ancestors had been, you're going to discover some additional relatives with different surnames that were traveling to the same address, and you will make more discoveries. So I promise you that this will come also to MyHeritage. And it's all thanks to actually doing genealogy hands-on. I continued to research Isaac Pat, and I found his World War I draft record from 1918, and I filed the address where he was living at in Chicago in my memory for later, and you will soon see its significance. And now for something really interesting. My grandfather left me a real treasure, a suitcase. He could have been nostalgic. I don't know, this could have been the suitcase that he actually used to immigrate to Israel in 1920, or it was a later suitcase. But it was an old suitcase. And inside, he left lots of letters and documents. And it was handed over. I was supposed to receive it, but some other member of the family got it. And it was only recently that it was passed on to me. And inside, there were notes by my grandfather to me, because he somehow believed that I am going to be the historian of the family. I was only 13 years old when he left those notes, but somehow he said, you know, Gilad will inherit this suitcase and will take good care of this. So the suitcase got to where it was supposed to, and inside there were many, many treasures. The most important one was a huge package of letters, correspondence between my grandfather and his family in Bialystok from the early years, 1920 until 1926, when he was the only family member in Israel. We're talking about more than 500 letters. That's a huge treasure, because that period in the history of Israel is scarcely documented. Now remember that he was assigned the stenotype, and he wanted extra practice. And I think he was also proud. So he used it to write all the letters. And it kept a copy. Now, whoever had a photocopy machine in 1920? Nobody. So this was, in fact, the only way that he could retain a copy of the letters. The letters were sent to Bialystok, and they were lost. They were destroyed. But I have the copies of each and every letter. So that's an amazing treasure, and the fact that they were written by this machine means that they're easy to read, and I don't need to tackle horrible handwriting, which I know many of you have faced. So we're talking about more than 800 pages, very dense. He didn't know about carriage return line break. Lots and lots of content. He was documenting what life was like in the early years in the Holy Land, and that's very, very rich historical content with events that he documented from a first-hand experience. He really touched history, combined with rich genealogical family stories. This is a dream come true for every genealogist. It's a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. And it's quite intimidating, all that material. And I've always said, one day I'm going to publish it in a book. And I decided recently that the day has come. And I've started working on this again. And I've read all the material again. It's quite emotional. I was shaken. But there's some parts of it in Yiddish that I don't understand. So I'm having that translated right now. And one of the questions that puzzled me was, did my grandfather know his cousin Isaac Pat in Chicago from the branch of Uncle Yehuda? So I looked at the very tiny slips of paper, very, very small, that my grandfather kept because he sent his letters to Bialystok in registered post, and he scribbled the addresses. And lo and behold, I found the address of Isaac Pat. It was attached to a letter that says, "To my dear cousin." So I had no idea who it was going to, but it was going to Mr. Pat in the same address of Isaac Pat from the World War I record. So they had, in fact, been in touch. And this is the beauty of our work as genealogists. We are righting the wrongs of history, and we are reconnecting ties that were broken for 100 years. This connection was severed in 1921, and now, in 2018, I am now back in touch with the descendants of Isaac Pat and celebrating the heritage of our family. Now, I'm going to give you a worldwide scoop. You are the first to hear about it. And it's from another bit of treasure that I found in the suitcase, and I found it quite recently when I was paying more attention to some of the papers that I previously put aside. Now, I find it very significant that I'm telling you this in Oslo, because Oslo was the site of the last successful peace talks between Palestinians and Israelis, and that led to the Oslo Peace Accords. So what I'm about to tell you now is a secret memo in the possession of my grandfather about secret peace talks between the Jews and the Arabs in 1924. And this material was never published before. The protagonist that you see here is King Abdallah I. He was ruler of Transjordan in 1921 and for 30 years. Later, he became formally the King of Jordan. He was assassinated in 1951 because people heard that he was about to negotiate and sign a peace treaty with Israel. History could have been different. And so this King Abdallah hosted in 1924 a delegation of Jewish leaders. My grandfather was not one of those leaders. He was only a secretary in the Vaad Leumi, but he got to type up the memo on his stenotype. So this is a 7-page memo that describes the entire protocol of the secret meetings in Jordan between the Jewish leaders and the Jordanian leadership. And they were discussing how the Jews and the Arabs can cooperate in harmony and build the land, the Holy Land, together. The delegation included a famous Zionist called Colonel Kish from the British Army and David Yelin, who was a chairman at the Vaad Leumi, and also the chief rabbi of Israel. And this is the only copy because this has never seen the light, has never been published. I'm planning now to publish it in Israeli media, so look out for it in the next few days. I'm hoping that it will inspire the current generation to pursue peace, that it will show people the very brave actions of the former leaders who almost made it, and maybe it will happen in our generation. By the way, in the assassination of Abdallah I that happened actually in Jerusalem, his grandson, King Hussein, who was a young boy, was injured, but there was a medal on his chest that deflected the bullet, and he was saved. And eventually, King Hussein pursued the same path of his grandfather and signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1994. And it's tragic that the Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, was murdered, was assassinated 1 year later in 1995 for pursuing peace in the Middle East. So we have tragic history, but we always dream of a better future. And my grandfather, I bet he was very proud to have been close to history, and he touched history. And that's why he left this memo behind for us. And two other small anecdotes from that magical suitcase that were dear to my grandfather. This is an armband that was assigned to him when he was a very junior secretary in 1921. And he wrote on it in his handwriting that he wore this when he was an usher. He was taken care of order in a very important event attended by Lord Balfour, sitting right next to him. And Balfour was the man who made the famous Balfour Declaration, promising the Jews a homeland in Palestine. So again, my grandfather touched history, being so close to this person, and he kept that armband that has the formal stamps that allowed him the entry. And I told you that my grandfather loved sports and exercise. He was a gymnast from Maccabi Bialystok. He really passed that on big time to my father, and my father passed it on to me. That's why I was one of the only ones to be seen yesterday jogging in my shorts in the park of Oslo. So that's really strong in my family. And here, in a letter from 1921, my grandfather Chaim is organizing one of the first football teams in Israel. He's writing a letter asking the Vaad Leumi to release early on Tuesday afternoons the clerks. So they are forming a football team, and my grandfather say, you must understand the importance of physical exercise for these people. So this is another small anecdote, not history perhaps, but equally important to me, and I'm very proud of this. So in the last few days, I found the time and I updated my family tree with the entire descendants of Isaac Pat. Of course, there was a genealogist on the other side, but I had to verify every bit and every piece of information, and I found even more about that branch, all added to the sun chart of the Pat family. More than 100 people magically added to my paternal descendant chart. So to conclude this story, first I hope my grandfather would have been proud of me. And you can see here a lovely picture of the two of us. And really, genealogy is never done. Even if you are a very experienced genealogist, even if you think you know it all, you think you found it all, there are always more amazing stories waiting for you to discover them. And I want to end this part of my talk with a saying by Jeff Rasmussen, who introduced me this morning: life is short, do genealogy first. Thank you. Okay, so that was pleasure. Now we move on to business, but still business mixed with pleasure. I want to make some new announcements in this conference, and some of them for the very first time ever. Now, I have to tell you this. We still have ahead of us 2 fantastic days full of lectures by my colleagues, and I don't want to steal their glory. So I'm not going to give you the whole roadmap of MyHeritage. Our VP product, Maya, will do that later this afternoon. I will steal only a little bit from her. So, some new announcements. The first one is about DNA and genealogy. Now, as most of you already know, the most useful aspect of DNA testing is finding relatives through DNA matches. You can also find the ethnicity, but at MyHeritage, we think that the DNA matches are more important, and we've been putting more focus on the DNA matching side. Now, one of the biggest challenges is that you take a DNA test, and it finds thousands of relatives or hundreds of relatives, and then the challenge is to figure out how exactly you are related to your DNA matches, because DNA will often not tell you that. And a DNA result can tell you that this person is probably your third cousin or your fourth cousin, but it's up to you to figure out how exactly you are connected. We've been releasing a lot of useful tools that make that easier. We have a chromosome browser that you can look at the segments and try to determine which ancestor you have in common with your DNA match. We give you smart matches between your tree and the tree of the match, if they have a tree. We look at surnames of the ancestors of your DNA match and your own ancestors. And we try to look for identical surnames, because if you have a certain Pat ancestor, that gives away immediately how you are probably related. So these tools are very useful, but additional tools and clues are always welcome. I'm very proud to introduce to you our new mega feature, Shared Ancestral Places. And that is already live on the website since yesterday silently, and now formally announced for the first time ever. Shared ancestral places are places of birth and death of the ancestors of both sides of the DNA match. These are the locations where the ancestors lived. Whenever you have a DNA match, we check the family trees of you and the DNA match, and we try to find if there are ancestral places in common, because if there are, they are important clues that can show how the two of you are related. Now, you could have done it manually, but it's impossible to look through the ancestries of thousands of DNA matches and look at the places of birth and death of each one of your DNA matches. We have done it for you. So here on the DNA match card, we highlight if there are shared ancestral places. And in the review match page, there is a new, lovely, interactive component that shows you on the map the ancestral places from your side and the DNA match, and we highlight with purple pins if there are shared locations. And we show you the ancestral events, which ancestor of yours and the other match occurred in that location. And this is not just at the level of country, but also down to the level of city, town, or village, which can be enlightening. And we show that on a map, because you might see an ancestral location of yours that is in fact not identical, but very close to an ancestral location of your DNA match. We show this to you, and this is a very powerful clue and tool to help you make sense of your DNA matches. So here is an example from my own family tree. I have this match with someone called Richard, and it's showing me that he has ancestors from Białystok in Poland, same as me. This kind of discovery alone could have allowed me to find the lost branch of Yehuda Tzadik Bat. Though in this case, it was chicken and egg. First I found him, then I DNA tested him. But sometimes DNA comes first, and then you make the discovery. And you can see how easy it would have been, and you can see the other shared locations that his family has and my family has. We also show you ancestral places that only you have or only the DNA match has, and of course, those that are shared. The technology that compares the places is very smart. It's based on geocoding, which means that we convert the place names into coordinates. We don't do a naive textual comparison. So if you wrote Białystok in one spelling and the other guy wrote it in Hebrew or Russian or Greek or spelled it differently, it doesn't matter. We figure out the location and then we match thanks to the location. And in fact, we are going to display these place names in your language. So if you are a user from Norway, you're going to see the place names translated to your language because we know how to translate names as well. It's a very smart feature. Someone has to pay the bills, so it's also a paid feature. It's available for MyHeritage subscribers and to people who upload the DNA data to MyHeritage, but only if they do it until December 1st. After that, it will become paid for people who upload after that date. This is the first release. We have a lot of improvements planned. This is the work of the genius engineering team in Israel, and it was led and supervised by our very talented DNA product manager, Ran Sneer, who is here in Oslo, and he will present to you probably right after this or soon after this. So you can hear it from the man himself. And it's live on MyHeritage right now. Don't go away, but take a look at it later. So that's shared ancestral places. So you can have the best technologies in the world, but you also need the historical records to make historical, fascinating and amazing discoveries. And we keep adding more and more historical records for your benefit. So here I'm happy to announce for the first time that we are working on a massive project, the US City Directory project, in advanced stages, coming soon to MyHeritage, with about 1 billion records. This is a huge, huge collection and extremely useful. The city directories are an old version of the phone directories, and they exist even before the invention of the phone. I think it was invented 1876, and these city directories begin earlier in the 19th century. They are listing everyone and the address where they lived. And in many locations, we have them year after year after year. So this is a great census supplement. The census in the United States is every 10 years, in some states every 5. Here, you can track people in between these census years, and you can find out who lived in the household. So if you do the detective work and you look very closely at these records, you'll be able to find exactly who lived in the household, what was the occupation, people coming and going, people getting married and people dying. This is a fantastic resource. Now, the US city directories are already found in a few places on the internet. This is not going to be exclusive for MyHeritage, but the MyHeritage collection will be the smartest one. We are taking the time to process these records and do a good job of it. We are converting the records into a structured data, and we are actually understanding the abbreviations. As you can see on the right, sometimes it's a bit cryptic to read this. Every city and every state had their own abbreviations. We figured it out, and we are creating a database that is also consolidated. If your relative lived in the same location year after year, we're going to consolidate that into one record instead of having 20 records appear in your search results and pollute them. So you can look forward to a fantastic collection if you have relatives in the United States of about 1 billion records. It's going to be the smartest collection of its kind. It's not available on MyHeritage yet, but we are working hard on it, and it will be coming soon. Announced here for the first time. And then I will invite you to track your ancestors year over year. For our European users and for all our users who have ancestors from Europe, I'm happy to say that we are working now to add newspapers from Europe to MyHeritage, millions of them. We are going to adjust our unique newspaper matching technology to the other languages. Currently it works in English, so that we will match the newspaper articles automatically to the individuals in your family tree and deliver them to you as record matches. So in the first wave, we have millions of newspapers coming from the Netherlands and Austria, and in subsequent waves, we will be adding many more countries. Now, you might say, okay, the newspapers in Norway or Sweden are already available online and I can search them. That's true, but on MyHeritage, they will be matched automatically to your family tree, and few of us have the time to search for every person in the newspapers. And the MyHeritage technology works with synonyms, whereas searching with newspapers is typically exact words. So we'll be able to find your relatives in the newspapers like no one is able to do, even if the newspapers are available elsewhere. And we are now working hard to bring those European newspapers to MyHeritage, and we have the best technology for utilizing them. These are European newspapers describing the sinking of the Titanic. This is interesting. We have a great partnership with Family Search, and we are working together on digitizing new collections that they have microfilmed around the world. And so we are working in various stages on unique content that has never been digitized before. For example, the Czech Republic census. We are working on that. We are working on Brazil records. And these are meetings in the Brazil archives that took place. And we are also working on German records that have never been indexed before. Now, these projects are in various stages. For example, the German project has been signed and started. It will take some time before the content reaches MyHeritage, but it will. The content is all flowing in various stages, and millions of new records are coming. We are leaving no territory unhandled because we realize that genealogy is international, so all of you will probably have new records relevant to your research. And now I'm switching to something else, and I'm going to make a little bit of a controversial statement. My analogy is that the DNA of your ancestors is like great wine, it's like fine wine, and you have it but diluted. For example, if I think about my grandfather Chaim, I can find his relatives by getting matches for me, but I have on average only 25% of his DNA. So my ability to find his relatives, my own relatives that are related through his branch, is quite limited when I have only 25% of his DNA inside me. There is more of his DNA in my siblings and in my cousins, but it's separated. It's not brought together. And so, it's quite interesting if I could get the DNA of my grandfather Chaim. Wouldn't that be interesting? Now, this is what I'm going to focus on in the next 10 minutes. This is just a brief diagram, a primer about how DNA matching works. Many of you here are DNA experts, so this will bring you to sleep. Some of you may not have tried DNA testing yet, so this could be interesting for you. DNA is an extremely important part in the future of genealogy, and I really encourage all of you who have not jumped in yet to embrace it. It doesn't replace traditional research, it only augments it, and you may find new things that you would not find otherwise. So this is another important tool in your toolbox, and a good genealogist should use every tool available. Here at the bottom of this diagram, we see two first cousins. And you can see that the father of one of them was a sibling to the mother of the other, and they share two grandparents. Now, I'm showing here a single chromosome for simplicity, but imagine that this is repeated 23 times for each pair of chromosomes. And you can see by the way of DNA inheritance and recombination that each of us gets 50% from our father and 50% from our mother, but they represent a mixture from our grandparents. So we don't exactly get 25% of each grandparent. We can get 20% and 30%, as long as the total is 50% from each side. And statistically it happens that we inherit the same segments of DNA from our ancestors. From my father, I have exactly 50% of his DNA. From my grandfather, I have on average 25% of his DNA, and that arrives in segments. In this example, the two cousins have this segment in common that is marked in orange. Each of them got it from the parent, and it came from the shared grandparents. And this is how DNA matching works. We look at your DNA, we compare your DNA to the DNA data of all the other users on MyHeritage. There are nearly 2 million kits by now, 2 million people in the DNA database, 1.9+ million. And we look for segments that are identical. And by the quantity and length of those segments, we tell you statistically what is the relationship between you and your DNA match. For example, if it's 25%, this could be your grandfather, this could be your grandson, and this could be your half-brother, for example. So, trust me on this when I tell you that you really need and you want your ancestors' DNA. All of it, not just 25% of it. So our recommendation is for people to always test themselves and to test the oldest family members and ancestors in their family while you still can, because we don't want you guys digging up anyone from the grave, do we? So don't do that. But you really want the DNA of your ancestors because it amplifies your signal. And I'm going to illustrate that with a few examples. If you're looking for a first cousin, it's quite easy. You will have, on average, a 12.5% match, the same DNA. That's impossible to miss. You won't miss your first cousin. But if you had your grandparents' DNA in the database, the grandparent would match that cousin 25%. So that would be a double match. And that becomes more significant when you are looking for slightly more distant relatives like your second cousins and even your third cousins. Because if you look at your second cousin, you match that person on average by around 3%. But if you had your great-grandparents' DNA in the database, the signal will be amplified by 4. And it would be matching by, on average, by 12.5%. So it would be really useful if you could have the DNA of your ancestors in the database and you could look at the matches that this DNA generates, because that is like illuminating a beacon and finding relatives from that branch in much better resolution, in a much larger signal. And you would then know exactly how they're related to you. Because if this is a match of your grandfather, you may also match that person, but much smaller. You get quite closer to the truth. And you can do that not for all your ancestors, but for those that you have a particular interest in. You know how it is when a parent is not supposed to have a favorite child, but some of them have a favorite child. So us genealogists, some of us have a favorite ancestor that we put more focus in our research, and so that's natural and human. So you really want to have the DNA of that ancestor in the database so you can get matches direct to the source. Problem is, ancestors are, for most of us, deceased. They are in heaven, we would like to think. How do we get their DNA into the database? So we're going to offer you 2 solutions for this. And this is where it gets really interesting. The first solution is to reconstruct the ancestral DNA because it got distributed to the descendants of that ancestor. I have 25% of my grandfather on average, and my sister will have 25% on average also. But some of that 25% will be different. And if I can combine the DNA of my grandfather that she has and I have, I can gradually build more and more of my grandfather's DNA. And if I could test my father, but he's deceased also, then I would have 50% of my grandfather. So first I need to reconstruct actually the DNA of my father, and so on. So the way you do this is you give DNA tests to your cousins, to your second cousins, to the cousins of your parents. And like I said, you start with the eldest family members because genealogy is a race against time. You give them the DNA kits. In my experience, if you give them a free kit, if you buy the kit for them, they will usually test it. Don't expect them to purchase the kit, but If you sponsor the kit for them, many of them will agree to test. And then you have the benefit of, if they allow you to manage their kit on MyHeritage, then you know where they are on the family tree. The kit can be assigned to that individual in the family tree. And then lots of interesting things can happen as you reconstruct the DNA of your ancestors, which is a job that MyHeritage intends to automate for you and do it for you. If I go back to this example, if I know that this is a cousin, if I gave my cousin a kit and the DNA result proves that they are a cousin, then MyHeritage can automatically find the common segment and escalate it to my match's father and to my own mother, and it comes from one of the two grandparents. We don't know yet which one, so I'm going to put that segment in the middle between the grandparents. But I can already escalate the segment one generation. And if I test a second cousin, then I can escalate the segments 2 generations, right to the grandfather or grandmother, and in the middle of the great-grandparents. MyHeritage will not do this if you get a first cousin match who is an unknown stranger, because we don't know exactly how you're related. But if you sponsor a kit and you give it to your cousins, which many, many thousands of our users, tens of thousands of our users are doing already, then MyHeritage will take the information from the DNA results of the kits that you are managing, together with the family tree data, and we will automatically escalate the segments to reconstruct the DNA of your ancestors in heaven. And we will allow you to create virtual kits from those ancestors so you can generate matches for them, which is exactly the DNA of my beloved grandfather Chaim, which I can then build from all of us in the family, and then I can have his DNA. It does not have to be complete. It's not going to be complete, but it can be 80, 90% of his DNA, which is better than 25% that I have today. And I'm going to get fantastic matches and make new discoveries with a stronger signal. So this is the technique that we're going to add to MyHeritage. And by having this, you will gain other benefits, because we will have information about different segments. So if you have a match, we'll be able to look at the segments that you have in common and tell you, oh, we know this segment because we've escalated it to your grandmother, Rosa. So obviously, you are related to this DNA match through grandmother Rosa. And it brings you closer to find the MRCA, the most recent common ancestor between you and the match. And it allows you to focus on DNA matches of your favorite people, the people that you care about in your genealogy research. And it makes it easier to achieve, to find the holy grail in DNA matching, which is to understand exactly how you are related to your DNA matches. So what I've described to you now is the first technique that we are going to provide to get the DNA of your ancestors and use them. But there is another technique that you can start to use even sooner. And that is from old envelopes and stamps. Now, those of you who, like me, are passionate stamp collectors, we are an extinct kind, but you know, I'm magnetically drawn to this penny black. I don't know why, I see it and I smile. So I'm a stamp collector, and unfortunately I'm very sad to see this hobby becoming slowly extinct. Less people are doing stamp collecting, they're playing too many games with smartphones, and they don't have time for good old education that can come from stamp collecting. And people are hardly using stamps today and hardly writing letters. It's all emails and emoticons, emojis. But the good news is that in the good old days, our ancestors loved to write letters, and most of them did. And many of us genealogists have in our possession letters that our ancestors and other relatives wrote to each other. And I hope that, like me, you have kept those letters as treasures. And maybe our ancestors did not realize it, but when they were licking those stamps and the envelope flaps, they were sealing their precious DNA for you forever. So we can now go to those envelopes. There's not going to be DNA in the letters themselves, but in the envelope. And it's such a shame that a lot of the stamp collectors would put a bath of water and peel away the stamp and throw away the envelope and put the stamp in our collection. But those of you who did not do that and who kept the envelope has the DNA protected under the stamp and inside the self-adhesive glue of the envelope. And it is possible to extract the DNA from that with very high success rates. And the stamp can be fresh, a few years old, and it can be 100 years old. The DNA is still there. And the more DNA, the more stamps, the more envelopes you find, the better your chances. So MyHeritage is going to form a partnership with a company that specializes in the extraction of DNA from these conditions. And the partnership will allow you to send over an envelope and get the results loaded into MyHeritage, just like a regular cheek swab kit, which you can then assign to an individual in your family tree. And we expect you to do that with your ancestors. So, my dear grandfather Chaim, in his suitcase, there are some envelopes. Here is a letter, a postcard that he sent in the last 2 years of his life, but the address was wrong and it was returned to the sender. It was returned to him. How lucky, because the postcard has 2 stamps. And knowing my grandfather, he would lick them himself. So I have his DNA here, and that's only 35 years old. And that's recent. But I have an even better option. My grandfather was a proud member of the Workers' Union, and I found his booklet. Every month he would pay taxes, and he would get a small stamp to affix. And there are about 500 stamps that he licked in that booklet. That's enough DNA for 1,000 DNA kits. So already as we speak, these samples are in the lab being extracted. Grandfather Chaim's DNA is on its way to MyHeritage. And then I will be able to make even more connections. Grandmother Rosa is a tougher challenge. Unlike my grandfather, she didn't write many letters. But she wrote 2 love letters to my grandfather in 1926. And he kept them because he was an archivist historian himself. And I've got those letters. So I have from my grandmother these 2 stamps and a sealed envelope. I think I have her DNA now. We will know pretty soon. Now, why stop there? I see you're one step ahead of me reading the slides. You know, in the Starship Enterprise, the TV series Star Trek that I used to watch as a kid, to boldly go where no one has gone before, that's what I love doing. And this is what I want to try here with DNA. I happen to have one of the world's largest collection of autographs, historical autographs, because I'm, as you know by now, a passionate lover of history. And I've been collecting these autographs throughout decades. Now they suddenly have a hidden use. And as we speak, DNA is being extracted from some fantastic items. So I'd like to share that with you. The first is Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism. He had the vision of bringing the Jews back to the Holy Land and establishing an independent state. Herzl had a tragic life. He died in 1904 at a very young age, and his line of descendants was cut. He had 3 children, and they did not survive. He had 1 grandchild who is dead. The line is extinct, and very little is known about his relatives. I have in my collection an extremely rare postcard written by the daughter of Herzl, Truda Herzl. It is perhaps the only thing anyone has of the daughter. And there's a stamp there. So I can get 50% of Herzl's DNA through his daughter. Now, I'm probably not going to check if Herzl and his wife were 100% Ashkenazi Jewish, although that would be fun. I would like to find relatives of Herzl, because no one knows who they are. Now, this is an area that has big ethical considerations. There's a lot to think here, and one needs to tread very carefully and be very cautious. This is a new field, and the ethics still have to be developed. Herzl does not have any known descendants, so I don't think anybody will complain. But this has got to be done very, very carefully. And I promise to share the results with you. But I have only one stamp. So the chances of obtaining the DNA are 50-50, and I hope this will be successful. I also have in my collection other amazing items. For example, envelopes handwritten by Albert Einstein and Winston Churchill. Their DNA is coming to MyHeritage very, very soon. And I think it will be amazing for people to find if they are related to Winston Churchill or to Albert Einstein. No other database has their DNA. So this is going boldly when no one has gone before. Perhaps after my talk, some of you will go back home and start looking for those precious envelopes. Perhaps some of you have celebrity envelopes. Remember where you got the idea first. DNA is a bold new world that opens new frontiers. Some good, some bad. I think mostly good. It's very important to use it wisely. So, to summarize, I hope I have convinced you that it's extremely important to obtain the DNA of your ancestors, that it will allow you to get a bigger signal to find your own relatives. We're going to offer you two methods for doing that. One, by reconstructing the DNA of your ancestors from your own relatives. And you need to buy some more DNA tests for that. And the other is by using stamps and envelopes of your ancestors, extracting the DNA, and we will provide you a method to get the data directly into MyHeritage. And so this is part of the future of genetic genealogy. And if you are a DNA fanatic like me, and I'm recognizing some DNA fanatics here in the audience, I'm sure you will be all over this. If you have not tried DNA yet, start with yourself, and we will go from there slowly. So, to close my presentation and leave some time for questions, I just want to say that, as you have seen, MyHeritage was created by genealogists for genealogists. We care about genealogy, we love genealogy, we are going to continue to care for genealogy. We've been around for 15 years, we plan to sticking around with you. Our focus is on innovating technology for genealogy. DNA is a big part of the future of genealogy, and new records and new technologies are coming to MyHeritage every day, and exciting things are coming in the near future as well. The future is very, very exciting. Thank you.